The rain fell on Cedar Brook with a relentless, metallic hiss, a sound that seemed to soak into the very soul of the town. It was a late October downpour, the kind that stripped the remaining golden leaves from the oaks on Main Street and left the world looking skeletal and raw. From the expansive window of her mayoral office, Eliza Vance watched the water sheet down the glass, distorting the view of the town square and the grim, hulking silhouette of the Ethelred manufacturing plant beyond the river. At 34, Eliza possessed a poise that was both innate and meticulously cultivated. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe but elegant chignon, and her suit, a deep navy wool, was immaculate. She was the youngest mayor Cedar Brook had ever elected, a whirlwind of progressive energy and fiscal responsibility. But tonight, the energy felt more like a tremor of anxiety. On her polished oak desk lay a report, its conclusions as stark and unforgiving as the weather. Ethelred Manufacturing, the town's largest employer for 3 generations, was bleeding money. Its machinery was obsolete, its market share had evaporated, and its environmental compliance costs were about to skyrocket. The report's final recommendation was a single, devastating word: closure. A soft knock interrupted her grim reverie. "Come in," she said, her voice steady, a tool she had mastered long ago. Her chief of staff, a young, earnest man named Ben, entered. "The union is here, Eliza. They're agitated." "I would be too," she murmured, turning from the window. "Send in their representative. Let's get this over with." The door opened wider, and the man who stepped through was both a ghost from her past and a living, breathing embodiment of her present crisis. Leo Thorne. Time had broadened him, filling out the lanky frame of the boy she'd known. His shoulders, once hunched over debate notes, now seemed to carry the weight of the entire factory floor. His dark, curly hair was shorter, tamed but still rebellious, and lines around his eyes spoke of long hours and hard worries. He wore a worn leather jacket over a flannel shirt, a uniform of practicality that stood in stark contrast to her own. But his eyes, the same intense, moss-green eyes that had once bored into hers across a high school auditorium, held the same fire. "Mayor Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the easy charm he'd once wielded like a weapon. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, the formality a brittle shield. "Please have a seat." He didn't. He stood before her desk, a pillar of contained energy. "We got wind of the report, Eliza. Don't bother with the political soft shoe. Is it true? Are you trying to kill Ethelred?" The use of her first name was a deliberate jab, a reminder of a time before titles. She met his gaze, her own a cool, determined blue. "I'm not trying to kill anything, Leo. The numbers are doing that all on their own. The city can't afford to keep propping up a failing enterprise. The tax breaks, the infrastructure subsidies, it's a leaky bucket. We're pouring public money into a hole." "It's not a hole, it's a community," he shot back, his composure cracking. "It's my father, who worked there for 40 years. It's Maria Flores, who supports her 3 kids on that line. It's old man Henderson, whose pension is tied to that place. You're not just closing a factory, you're turning off the life support for this entire town." "And what happens when the town goes bankrupt trying to save it?" she countered, her hands flat on the desk. "What happens when we can't fund the schools or fix the roads because we're shackled to a corpse? This isn't a debate, Leo. This is reality." A bitter smile touched his lips. "It's always a debate with you and me, isn't it? Some things never change." The air crackled with the memory of it. Cedar Brook High, 15 years ago. They were the stars of the debate team, but never partners. Always opponents. He was the firebrand, the emotional orator who argued from the heart, who could make an audience feel a position as if it were their own. She was the ice queen, the master of logic and data, her arguments constructed like fortresses, impenetrable and cold. They'd faced each other in countless tournaments, their rivalry the stuff of school legend. He'd won the state finals, she'd triumphed at nationals. The score was never settled. And now, here they were, on the biggest stage of their lives, with the future of Cedar Brook hanging in the balance. "This is different," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "This isn't about trophies." "I know," he said, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by a weary resolve. "That's why I'm fighting. I'm not fighting you, Eliza. I'm fighting for them. We have a counterproposal, a modernization plan. Give us 6 months. Let us try to find a buyer, restructure." 6 months is 6 months of losses the city can't absorb, she said, but the refusal lacked its earlier finality. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the genuine love for the town they both, in their own ways, called home. She had left for college, for law school, and had returned with ambition. He had never left, digging his roots deep into the soil of Cedar Brook. "Just look at it," he pleaded, placing a worn manila folder on her desk. "That's all I'm asking. Look at our plan before you make a final decision." He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Eliza alone with the drumming rain and the ghost of their past. She looked from the slick, professional report on her left to the humble, hand-annotated folder on her right. 2 futures for Cedar Brook. And trapped between them, the unresolved history of a boy and a girl who had once argued about abstract philosophies, now tasked with arguing over the very soul of their home. The Cedar Brook Gazette didn't bother with subtlety. The headline blared, "Mayor Vance versus Union Thorne. Debate heats up over Ethelred's fate." Leo crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it onto the scarred wooden table of the millstone, the bar that had been his father's second home and was now his. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food, a comforting, familiar miasma. "She didn't outright say no," he told the small, grim-faced group huddled around the table. Maria Flores, whose hands were calloused from 30 years on the assembly line, Jim Henderson, whose father had helped build the factory, and a few other shop stewards. "Didn't say yes, either," Jim grumbled, his voice a gravelly echo of a lifetime of smoking. "That one, she's always been too smart for her own good. Even in high school, she had that look. Like she was calculating the square root of your soul." Leo smiled faintly. He remembered that look. He'd found it infuriatingly attractive back then. Now it was just infuriating. "We need to make noise," Maria said, her dark eyes flashing. "A rally. Show her that it's not just a few jobs on paper. It's people. It's families." "A rally is good," Leo agreed, his mind already racing, falling into the old patterns of strategy and persuasion. "We need public sentiment on our side. We need to make the cost of closure personal for the city council." He was building his case not with data, but with stories. The heart argument, his specialty. Meanwhile, in City Hall, Eliza was building her own. She stood before a large screen, presenting the cold, hard facts to her council. Charts showing the decline in revenue. Graphs projecting the impending debt. Photographs of the factory's rusting infrastructure. "The emotional argument is powerful, I grant you that," she said, her pointer tap-tapping against the screen. "But we cannot run a city on nostalgia. Ethelred is a sinking ship. If we don't cut it loose, it will drag the entire town down with it. My proposal is to form an economic development committee to attract new, diverse businesses to Cedar Brook, to future-proof our community." "And what about the 300 people who will be unemployed in the meantime, Eliza?" asked Councilman Davies, an older man who represented the factory district. "What do they do?" "We will implement robust job retraining programs and offer assistance with placement," she replied, the answer ready, logical, and utterly inadequate to the human fear in the room. She saw the doubt on their faces. She was fighting Leo's heart with logic argument, and in this room, surrounded by people who had grown up with the thrum of the Ethelred machines as the town's heartbeat, she was losing. That evening, against her better judgment, she drove to the factory. She parked her sedan on the bluff overlooking the river and the sprawling complex below. In the twilight, the factory looked almost noble, its brick walls stained with decades of soot and effort. She could see the few lights still on in the offices, the skeletal outlines of the cranes against the purple sky. This was the view from her childhood bedroom window. The sight and sound of it had been the backdrop to her life. She remembered her own grandfather taking her on a tour, his pride as he showed her the massive presses that shaped steel, the assembly lines where men and women worked with a focused intensity. He'd told her, "This place, Liza, it's what built this town. It's not just a building. It's a promise. A promise of stability, of a future you could build with your own two hands." Was she now the one breaking that promise? A crunch of gravel made her turn. Leo stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, his breath misting in the chill air. "Come to see the patient before you pull the plug?" he asked, but the edge was gone from his voice. He just sounded tired. "Something like that," she admitted, hugging her coat tighter. "I used to love this view." "So did I." He came to stand beside her, not too close, but sharing the same space, the same perspective. "Remember Mr. Gable's history class? Our final project on the industrial history of Cedar Brook." A faint smile touched her lips. "You did your presentation on the labor movements. I did mine on the economic impact and the founding families." "Of course you did," he said, a genuine chuckle escaping him. "You had pie charts. In 10th grade." "Pie charts are informative," she retorted, the old rhythm of their banter returning for a fleeting moment. They stood in silence for a while, the past a palpable presence between them. "My dad's sick, Eliza," Leo said quietly, the confession ripped from him by the intimacy of the twilight. "The doctors say it's the lungs. 40 years of breathing in metal dust. That factory, it gave him a life, and it's taking it from him. But it's all he has. His identity. If you close it, you're not just taking his job. You're taking the meaning from his last years." Eliza felt his words like a physical blow. This was the human cost her report had so neatly categorized under social displacement. This was Leo's father, a man who had once given her a butterscotch candy from his overalls pocket. "Leo, she began, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? That the numbers didn't care? That the greater good was a cold comfort? "Just look at the plan, Eliza," he repeated his earlier plea, his eyes searching hers in the fading light. "Really look at it. There's a future in there. I know you can see it. You were always better at seeing the paths through the impossible than anyone I've ever known." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving her alone on the bluff, the weight of his words, his father's illness, and the shared history of the town pressing down on her. For the first time, the logical fortress of her position felt terribly, terribly lonely. The town hall meeting was a pressure cooker. The high school auditorium, the very place where their teenage rivalry had been born, was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with anxiety and the smell of damp wool. Eliza stood at the podium, her back straight, her voice amplified and clear as she laid out her case. She spoke of fiscal responsibility, of diversification, of a new vision for Cedar Brook that wasn't tied to a single, failing industry. She was logical, persuasive, and utterly remote. When Leo took the microphone, he didn't go to the podium. He walked to the edge of the stage, making himself one with the crowd. "The mayor talks about numbers," he began, his voice resonating through the room without the need for amplification. "She talks about projections and liabilities. But I want to talk about Dave Henderson, who met his wife on the Ethelred assembly line 40 years ago. I want to talk about the scholarship fund the company set up that sent my cousin to college. I want to talk about the sound of that shift change whistle that tells this town it's 5 o'clock, that another day's honest work is done." He painted a picture with his words, a vivid, living portrait of a community intertwined with its work. He spoke of the modernization plan, not as a pipe dream, but as a bridge to the future, a way to honor the past without being enslaved by it. He didn't attack Eliza. He simply presented a different truth, one written not in spreadsheets, but in the lives of the people in the room. The crowd was his. You could feel it. They cheered. They nodded. They wiped away tears. Eliza watched from the side, her stomach a knot of cold dread. He was winning. He was using the very skills they'd honed against each other as kids, and he was doing it masterfully. She had given them a lecture. He had given them a story. During the Q&A, a woman stood up, her voice trembling. "Mayor Vance, my boy, he's got asthma. They say the pollution from the plant might be making it worse. What about our health? What about our kids?" It was the opening Eliza needed, the hard, logical counter to Leo's emotional appeal. She stepped forward. "That's a crucial point, Mrs. Gable. The environmental impact is a significant factor. The cost of bringing the factory up to modern EPA standards is prohibitive. Keeping it open isn't just an economic risk, it's a public health one." The room divided instantly. Shouts erupted from both sides. "Our jobs matter. Our children's health matters." The meeting devolved into chaos. Leo tried to calm the crowd, but the genie was out of the bottle. Eliza had successfully introduced a wedge, pitting neighbor against neighbor, health against livelihood. As the council members called for order, Leo caught Eliza's eye across the tumultuous room. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a profound disappointment. He had appealed to their shared love for the town, and she had chosen to highlight its divisions. It was a tactical move, a classic debate strategy. If you can't win the argument on their terms, change the terms. But watching the anger and fear in the faces of her constituents, Eliza felt a sickening lurch in her gut. This wasn't a high school tournament. There was no judge to award points. There was only a town being torn in two, and she was one of the people holding the ropes. Later that night, she sat in her silent, modern apartment, the report and Leo's plans spread out on her glass coffee table. She picked up his folder. The pages were filled with passionate, handwritten notes, optimistic projections, and ideas that were bold, if underfunded. One page was a hand-drawn schematic for retrofitting the main press with more efficient, cleaner technology. It was naive. It was hopeful. She thought of Leo's father, slowly fading away in a small house a few blocks from the factory. She thought of Maria Flores's 3 children. She thought of the sound of the shift change whistle, a sound she realized she hadn't truly heard in years, but whose absence would leave a silence more deafening than any noise. She had won the battle in the auditorium by fracturing the opposition. But as she looked at Leo's desperate, heartfelt plan, she knew with a chilling certainty that she was losing the war for the soul of Cedar Brook, and perhaps for her own. The fracture became a chasm. The health versus jobs debate dominated conversations in grocery store lines and over backyard fences. Protests sprang up on both sides, workers holding "Save Our Jobs" signs outside City Hall, and a smaller but vocal group of parents with "Clean Air for Our Kids" placards. The town Leo loved was turning on itself, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He spent his days in the Union Hall, fielding frantic calls, trying to organize a counter-campaign, his voice growing hoarse from explaining and reassuring. The rally Maria had suggested was planned for the coming weekend, but the unified front he'd hoped for was already cracked. He found his father, Walter, sitting in his worn armchair, an oxygen tube tucked under his nose, watching the local news coverage of the conflict with a grim expression. "She's a sharp one, that Vance girl," Walter wheezed, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Just like her father. Cuts right to the quick." "She's cutting right to the town's jugular, Dad," Leo said, sinking onto the sofa opposite him. "Maybe," Walter conceded. "Or maybe she's just the only one willing to say what nobody wants to hear." He turned his head, his wise, clouded eyes fixing on his son. "You two were always at each other's throats, but there was a respect there. I saw it. You challenged each other. Don't let this fight, turn that into pure poison, son. You both love this place. That's the common ground. Start from there." Leo looked at his father, the man who had been his rock, now so fragile. The words struck a chord deep within him. He'd been fighting Eliza as an enemy, a symbol of cold, outside ambition. But she wasn't an outsider. She was the girl who had cried when she lost the state finals to him. Not because she lost, but because she felt she'd let her team down. She was the woman who had come back, against all odds, to try and lead the town that had always been slightly suspicious of her intellect and ambition. Meanwhile, Eliza was facing her own reckoning. The political victory of the town hall felt hollow. The editorials in the Gazette were increasingly critical, accusing her of being out of touch. Councilman Davies was wavering, fearing a recall petition. She decided to do something she should have done weeks ago. She put on a hard hat and a safety vest and asked Ben to arrange a full tour of the Ethelred plant. She needed to see the enemy, or rather, she needed to see if it really was the enemy. The factory floor was a cathedral of industry, vast and echoing. The air hummed with a low-frequency vibration and smelled of grease, hot metal, and ozone. It was louder, dirtier, and more visceral than any spreadsheet could convey. She saw the workers, their faces smudged with grime, their movements economical and skilled. They watched her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and a flicker of hope. The foreman, a burly man named Joe, showed her the massive, aging hydraulic presses, pointing out where seals were failing and efficiency was dropping. He showed her the foundry, a place of infernal heat and roaring flames. He wasn't hostile. He was a craftsman showing off his domain, his pride warring with his frustration at its decay. "This here," Joe said, slapping a palm against a giant, rust-speckled machine. "This is Big Bertha. She's cantankerous, she's slow, but damn if she can't still shape a perfect chassis frame. We know she's old. We know we need new tech. But it's not just the machine, Your Honor. It's the know-how. It's the years of listening to her creaks and groans and knowing what they mean. You can't download that into a computer." Eliza ran a hand over the cool, pitted metal of a finished part. It was solid, real. This was what the numbers represented. This was the work of human hands, the product of generations of skill. She thought of her grandfather's promise, a promise of dignity. On her way out, she passed a small, glass-walled office. Inside, on a cluttered desk, she saw a familiar, worn manila folder, lying open next to a half-eaten sandwich. Leo's plan. It was surrounded by schematics, coffee-stained printouts, and a child's drawing taped to the wall, a crayon sketch of a smiling person in a hard hat, labeled "My Daddy." The image lodged in her heart, sharp and undeniable. That night, she didn't go home. She went back to her office and pulled out both documents, the sterile, professional report and Leo's dog-eared, passionate proposal. She started reading his not as the opposition's flawed argument, but as a potential blueprint. The ideas were rough, the funding shaky, but the core was sound. A shift to specialized, small-batch manufacturing. A partnership with the local technical college for retraining. A phased retrofit of the most polluting systems. It was a hybrid approach. It wasn't her way or his way. It was a third way, a bridge. The following day was the union rally. Leo stood on a flatbed truck parked at the edge of the town square, microphone in hand, looking out at a sea of several hundred concerned faces. He was mid-speech, his voice rallying them, speaking of fight and hope when he saw her. Eliza Vance was standing at the back of the crowd, wearing a simple trench coat, her arms crossed, just listening. His words faltered for a second. The crowd, sensing his distraction, turned to look. A tense silence fell over the square. This was her territory, the political arena, and she had walked into the heart of his. Eliza didn't wait for an invitation. She walked forward, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea, a mixture of suspicion and curiosity on their faces. She reached the flatbed truck and looked up at Leo. "Can I have the microphone?" she asked, her voice calm but clear. He was stunned. This was a gamble that could backfire spectacularly for both of them. But he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen since they stood on the bluff. Not calculation, but clarity. He handed it to her. She climbed up onto the truck beside him, a startlingly symbolic act. She turned to face the crowd, her people, his people, their people. "For the past few months," she began, her voice amplified across the silent square, "I've been talking to you about numbers, about liabilities and projections. Leo has been talking to you about people, about history and heart. And we've both been right. And we've both been wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I was wrong to think this was a binary choice, save the factory as it is, or let it die. I was wrong to use the very real fears about health as a political weapon. For that, I am sorry." She paused, letting the apology hang in the air. It was a risk, an admission of weakness that went against every political instinct she had. "And I believe," she continued, turning to look directly at Leo, whose expression was one of pure, unvarnished shock, "that Leo was wrong to think the solution lies only in the past. The world has changed. The market has changed." She turned back to the crowd. "But I've spent the last week really looking at the reports, and at the factory, and at Leo's plan. And I see a path forward. It's not my path, and it's not his path. It's Cedar Brook's path. It's a path that honors the sweat and skill in this square, while embracing the future our children deserve. It's a path of managed transition, of phased modernization, of shared sacrifice and shared investment." She outlined it then, a rough synthesis of both their visions. A city-backed loan to fund the initial, most critical environmental upgrades, contingent on the union accepting a temporary pay freeze and the company agreeing to a joint management labor oversight committee. A 6-month window to aggressively seek new investors or buyers for the retooled, more efficient factory she proposed. "It's a risk," she admitted. "A big one. For all of us. But the bigger risk is letting this town tear itself apart. The bigger risk is giving up on each other." She handed the microphone back to a speechless Leo and stepped down from the truck. She didn't wait for applause or condemnation. She simply walked away, leaving a profound, ringing silence in her wake. Then, one person started to clap. Then another. It wasn't a roar of triumph, but a slow, building, thoughtful applause. It was the sound of a community being offered a thread of hope and, tentatively, cautiously, taking hold of it. Leo stood on the truck, watching her go, the microphone hanging limply at his side. She had just done what he had been unable to do. She had built a bridge. And in that moment, the rivalry that had defined them for half their lives finally, irrevocably, shifted into something else entirely. The following 6 months were the most grueling, exhilarating, and transformative of their lives. The Cedar Brook Compact, as the local paper dubbed it, was a fragile truce that required constant vigilance. Eliza and Leo found themselves in a state of forced and then chosen collaboration. Their meetings were no longer held in the formal setting of her office or the tense atmosphere of the Union Hall, but in the neutral, coffee-scented back room of the Millstone. The old debate team dynamic resurfaced, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a battle to defeat, but a vigorous, often heated, workshop to build. "The loan terms are non-negotiable, Leo," Eliza would say, tapping a clause in the contract. "The city council will never approve it without a tangible commitment from the workforce. And the workforce will never agree to a pay freeze without a concrete stake in the future," he'd counter, leaning over the table, his finger tracing a different line. "What about an employee stock ownership plan? It gives them skin in the game." She'd narrow her eyes, thinking, "It's unorthodox. The legal framework would be complex. But is it smart?" He'd press, a challenge in his eyes. A slow smile would sometimes break through her professional reserve. "It's not stupid. Let me run the numbers." He learned to appreciate the fortress of her logic. It gave their wildest ideas a solid foundation. She learned to value the engine of his passion. It fueled the long nights and rallied the weary workers. They became a team. Eliza's political acumen navigated the skeptical city council, while Leo's credibility with the workers ensured the temporary pay freeze passed by a narrow, but sufficient majority. They spent late nights together, surrounded by blueprints and financial models, the air between them shifting from adversarial to professional, and then, gradually, to something warmer. They shared stories of the years that had passed since high school. He told her about his brief, failed attempt at college, about coming home to care for his ailing mother, about finding his purpose not in a lecture hall but on the factory floor. She told him about the pressure of being the golden girl at an Ivy League school, about the loneliness of being the smartest person in the room, about the deep, driving me to prove that she hadn't left Cedar Brook behind, but had left to gain the tools to save it. One evening, after a particularly draining session with a potential investor from Chicago who had looked at their town with dismissive eyes, they found themselves on the bluff overlooking the factory. The upgrades had begun. The scaffolding and new, cleaner filtration systems were visible even in the moonlight. He didn't see it, did he? Leo said, his shoulders slumped. He just saw an old factory in a nowhere town. He saw what was, Eliza replied, standing beside him. Not what could be. We see it. That's what matters. He looked at her, her profile silvered by the moon. The carefully constructed walls between them were gone. Why did you do it, Eliza? He asked softly. Why did you step onto that truck? You could have just let me fail. It would have been the easier political path for you. She was quiet for a long time. Because my grandfather's promise, it wasn't just a promise of a job. It was a promise that this town takes care of its own. I realized I was breaking that promise by being too rigid. And because she turned to face him. Because Walter Thorne gave me a butterscotch candy when I was 7 and told me I was the smartest kid he'd ever met. And I couldn't stand the thought of letting him down. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He reached out, his work-roughened hand covering hers where it rested on the guardrail. It was a simple touch, but it felt like the closing of a circle that had been left open for 15 years. He asks about you, you know, Leo said, his voice thick. Every time I visit. How's that sharp Vance girl? You being nice to her? Eliza laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that Leo realized he hadn't heard since they were teenagers. Are you? Being nice to me? I'm trying, he whispered, his face inches from hers. And there, under the watchful eyes of the town and the silent, evolving factory, the last vestiges of their rivalry finally melted away, replaced by the first, tentative touch of a new beginning. The announcement came on a bright, crisp spring day, exactly 6 months and 1 week after Eliza had stepped onto the flatbed truck. A German engineering firm, specializing in precision automotive components, had been looking for a foothold in North America. They had been impressed not just by the retooled factory and the newly trained workforce, but by the unique partnership model between the city, the union, and the management. They saw it not as a liability, but as a strength, a community invested in its own success. The deal was signed. Ethelred Manufacturing would be reborn as Cedar Brook Precision Works. The jobs were saved, with a pledge to hire even more as the new product lines came online. The environmental upgrades would be completed ahead of schedule, making the plant a model of clean manufacturing. The town square, the same place where they had stood divided months before, was now filled with celebration. There was music, food, and a palpable sense of collective relief and joy. Eliza and Leo stood together on the steps of City Hall, watching the festivities. They were no longer mayor and union leader, but the architects of a miracle. You know, Leo said, a smile playing on his lips, I think we just won the state finals. Eliza shook her head, bumping her shoulder gently against his. No. This was nationals. Definitely nationals. He laughed and, in front of the entire town, took her hand. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Walter Thorne was there, in a wheelchair, his oxygen tank beside him, beaming with a pride that outshone the sun. Eliza walked over to him and knelt, taking his gnarled hand in hers. Told you you were the smartest kid I'd ever met, he wheezed, his eyes twinkling. Just took you a little while to figure out how to use it. I had a good teacher, she said, her eyes glistening as she looked from Walter to his son. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Leo and Eliza walked away from the crowd, down towards the river. The familiar thrum of the factory was different now, a newer, cleaner, more efficient sound, but the heartbeat was still there. So, what happens now? Leo asked, lacing his fingers through hers. The election is in a year. I hear the mayor is pretty popular. She has her moments, Eliza said, smiling. And I hear the union leader is practically a folk hero. He has his team to thank for that, he replied softly. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Eliza, all those years ago in high school, the reason I fought so hard against you, I think it was because I was desperately trying to get you to notice me. And the only way I knew how was to be your equal on that stage. Her heart swelled. I noticed you, Leo. I always noticed you. I was just too proud and too competitive to admit that the boy who argued from the heart was the only one who could ever get under my skin. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. And now, she said, rising on her toes to close the final, small distance between them, I think it's time we finally stopped debating and started something new. Their kiss was not a victory, nor a defeat. It was a collaboration, a merger of heart and mind, of past and future, a promise sealed for the town they had both fought for and for the love they had finally found at the crossroads of their lives.